Can you hear me? Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I
Oh,
was muted, so you couldn't hear me.
just to make sure. Okay, so is that okay? All right, good. So what we're gonna do with about 50 minutes of time is I'm trying to get through a lot of history. Hopefully you'll find some of it interesting, if not all of it. Tend to start with my own family. So the Vard name was originally Vardich. There are different spellings of it depending on what census results you use. They were originally from, I think, just north of Bialystok in Poland, though at the time it was the Russian Empire. They left in the late 1880s, ended up in London, where in the top right there you can see a photo of Israel Moses and his wife Francine when they were living in Whitechapel in the East End of London with their children. A generation later, their son Abraham and some of his brothers were facing a unpleasant situation. The draft was being brought in, conscription was being brought in Britain, and they didn't want to be conscripted and being sent off to die in World War One. So they had a look in the newspapers and they went, "Oh my God, what's this? Ireland, the place which was part of the UK at the time, but was not a place you could be conscripted from." So they moved. And the bottom, just below the 1890s photo, there is a photo of Abraham and his wife Daisy. And so they moved to Dublin, where at the time there was quite a thriving community, in particular in the south of Dublin, a place called Portobello, which we'll talk about. It was known locally as Little Jerusalem. And they settled there. They had a large family. See my grandfather and his brothers and his sister there in the middle bottom. And they all became furriers. At what point they got trained, we don't know. Probably London. And it was a kind of a perfect market for them. So they became very, very successful furriers. Their kids became teachers, lawyers, doctors, artists. Some stayed in Ireland, some didn't. Some did kind of all around the world, really. I have an uncle, bizarrely enough, who lives in Turkey. I have an uncle who lives in Las Vegas. The list goes on and on, really. Yeah, and they shortened the name to Vard, V-A-R-D. These days, there are not as many Jewish people in Ireland as you might imagine. There's about 2,500. There was once about 5,500, still very small. The reasons for that we'll talk about throughout the talk. But broadly speaking, Ireland was very, very poor, even by European standards. It was very poor back in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And there really wasn't a lot of reasons to come here. A lot of people were leaving in enormous numbers to come to America for which I presume you know well about as well. So there wasn't really a huge drive to come here. So these days, there are the most community, about 90% live in Dublin. There are two synagogues, one for the Reform, bottom right there, and one for the Orthodox, bottom left. The community is probably about half in number of more recent Israeli origin coming to Dublin to work in the tech sector within the last 15 years or so. And the other half are those who were descended mostly from Lithuanians who came here in the late 19th century. But we'll talk about that as we go along. I'm going to show you a brief video. This is mostly clips taken from Irish television in the 1950s and 60s. And it gives you a better sense of what the community would have looked like near enough to its peak. And there'll be a little jingly song to go along with it. So. Now, so we'll start at the beginning and try and work our way quickly enough through the early days of the community. So there has, in theory anyway, been a community of Jews on the island since the 12th century, though in reality it is pretty hard to trace all the residencies, I suppose, throughout that period. The first community, first mention of Jewish people in Irish history dates from about 1079, group of about 15 merchants came over from Normandy in France to open up trade with the Kingdom of Ireland at the time. Kind of stuff was given to the Irish king in Dublin, and they went back, but not hugely interesting. But it's the kind of the first bit of information we know about. About 100 years later, in the 1170s, the English king of the day, a man called Henry II, invaded Ireland in 1171, conquered most of the island, but not all, and kind of built up Dublin into what you can see is an artistic rendering of it there on the bottom left. But that's kind of roughly what the community would have been arriving on to in the 1180s. There was even there was a group of about 200 people who gave money towards the invasion, and one of the 200 was actually a Jewish man from Gloucester called Josh. We don't know much about him, but people have said, well, this must have been where this tiny community of maybe 100, 150 came from. They were certainly working, we imagine, within kind of the money lending sphere of things, given it was medieval Europe and there was very few things Jewish people could do at the time. But it was also possible they were working in the trades on the docks. We don't know really, because not enough information has survived. We know that the English, having conquered Dublin at the very least, and large parts of Ireland, were responsible for there being no Jewish people in Dublin from the year 1291. There was an edict of expulsion for Jewish people being expelled from England and all of its empire, which at the time included parts of Ireland. And as a result, we think the community disappeared then. But there's also tantalizing bits of information that suggest they may have moved to the south of Ireland, where the English were not in control of at the time, to a place called Cork, because there was indeed a Jewish community there from the 1490s, a combination of presumably the pre-existing community from the early medieval period and later arrivals from Portugal, which had expelled its Jewish population in 1497. But it's a bit of a mystery. Interesting fact, though, there were mayors of Cork who were Jewish even in the 1550s, which is a weird fact. But really, when we're talking about Jewish Ireland, we have to go to the 1660s, a rather unpleasant man by the name of Oliver Cromwell. There was a movie made about his life, if you don't want to read up on him. It came out in 1970. Very unpleasant man if you were Catholic. If you were the right type of Protestant, he was very fond of you, and he wasn't even that angry or that unpleasant towards Jewish people, because in 1657, he removes all laws banning Jewish people living in England and its empire. And as a result, in 1662, the very first synagogue that we know of anyway, is opened in Dublin, a place called Crane Lane, which you can see in the bottom left there. And indeed, the hope was that a community of Jewish people would settle in Ireland and help create a middle class, I suppose. That didn't happen. Ireland was still a very rural, kind of backward place at the time in terms of its economy, and more people were eager to move to London than they were to move to the tiny town of Dublin, a map of which you can see there. It was very, very small, less than 20,000 people at the time. Now, this community grows surprisingly, but not by an enormous amount. It's probably about 450, 500 individuals by the end of the 18th century. At that point, they were nicknamed the English Jews because they spoke English, and most poor Irish Catholics spoke Gaelic. And so this is a way of defining them as being kind of amongst those with property and of English and Scottish heritage. There was members of the Irish Parliament. They were mostly kind of traders. Some were bankers, others were architects. Some of the most famous architects actually of the mid-18th century were Jewish as well in Ireland, surprisingly, including the man who designed the current Irish Parliament, a man called Richard Castle, who was originally, I think, from Germany. We also have the very first Jewish cemetery opened, 1718. Bottom right there, you can see a small photo of it. which is now being made, or maybe already has been made into a museum. And there were about 2 synagogues in the middle of Dublin at the time. Now, that's all interesting stuff, but when it comes to numbers, you really have to come much more recently. The traditional story that everyone has heard, if they have only ever watched Fiddler on the Roof, then that's probably enough, is accurate in our case. Late 1870s, you start getting refugees coming to Dublin. The very first mention of refugees from the Russian Empire is 1876. A group of about 50 arrive in Dublin, and they are placed in public housing. The bottom or middle of this middle bottom, basically, you can see a photo there of Crane Lane, which is the street they were located in. But quite soon afterwards, of course, in 1881, you have the May Laws, which were passed by the Tsar Alexander III. I'm not related to him, just have the same name. Which obviously precluded Jewish people from large amounts of the economy. Certain areas you couldn't buy kind of property or buying property at all. Your rights are reduced, and then obviously the violent attacks on shtetls. This is stuff I'm assuming everybody knows. The community that came here at the time were not from Poland, like my family. They weren't from Ukraine or modern day Belarus. They were actually coming from a relatively, as things go, nice settled area for Jews at the time, which was actually Lithuania, the northwest of Lithuania for the most part. There was, I think, about 60% of those who arrived in Dublin were from one village called Achmeyan in the northwest of Lithuania. And we believe that they arrived kind of mostly because some people may have arrived in London, and been sent on from London to Dublin, which was a regional capital at that time of the United Kingdom. And so they arrived here. They said, it's not that bad. There's some slums and poverty, but there's a lot of housing being built, especially in the south of the city, which was quite a leafy suburb. And so they decided to stay. They also found that there was certainly surprising, historically, a surprising lack of anti-Semitism in the country at the time. The reason is relatively easy to explain, and it can probably be best explained by a joke. So this is an old joke from Belfast in the north of Ireland. And it's about a young boy. He's returning from Hebrew classes late at night by himself. He walks down the wrong street, and a group of teenagers push him up against a wall and they say to him, "Which foot do you kick with?" Which in Ireland back in the day meant, "What religion are you?" Basically, are you Protestant or are you Catholic? And he said, "Neither. I'm Jewish." And they are very confused for a second, but quickly get their heads and go, "Yes, but are you a Catholic Jew or are you a Protestant Jew?" Which should tell you everything you need to know, which was that there was, as often is the case in Europe, Jews were the other. In Ireland, there was already an other for both communities. For Protestants, the Catholic was the other, and for Catholics, the Protestants were the other. And so there just wasn't room to hate another group of people quite yet. And so they mostly go unnoticed. They settle in an area which was being developed south of Dublin called Portobello. It was being built up by the Guinnesses, particular Benjamin Guinness, public housing, but nice, good public housing, 2-story red brick, kind of artisanal dwellings they were known as. And so the community begins kind of, as much as a community ever flooded into Ireland, it flooded in, or certainly was a nice trickling stream, arrive, and they settle in this area. They open up about 23 kosher butchers, bakers, grocery stores in the area. You have 6 synagogues opened, very small synagogues, I should say, but such as the one you can see the middle bottom. You can see there Walworth Road Synagogue, which is still in existence, is opened about the 1880s, 1890s. It's pretty typical of the time, very small, kind of almost a synagogue per street almost. They arrive in at the time when there was, of course, an older community who were the English Jews. The newcomers were nicknamed the Crazy Russians because they were so much more religious, very much more ultra-Orthodox. And so there was not a lot of mixing to begin with. There was even a lot of stories of them not being too happy that these newcomers had shown up on their doorstep, making them look bad. That was not an unusual thing to say at the time. But other than that, they mostly settle in, and there's not really a huge amount of attention paid to them. There's even a newspaperman who comes up in the 1892, and he says, I heard about this. I walked up, and it was like walking through some quarter of Krakow or Warsaw, and there wasn't a word of English being spoken by anybody, and all the kids are running around speaking Yiddish, presumably, or Russian. But in reality, it actually is quite easy to settle in. There's a lot of local schools, which was handy for the kids. If you've ever lived abroad with a child, they're like sponges. They pick up languages relatively easily and accents. And so there was quite quickly kids running around with Dublin accents who spoke both English and Yiddish. Businesses kind of bloom, both because the community there provide them with obviously a way to make a living, but also the broader kind of Dublin is interested in buying stuff. My family is as tailors and furriers on both sides of my family were really relatively easy for them to find work. And the ability for artisans or kind of what the French might call the petit bourgeois, those who were able to kind of find work with their hands, but skilled work. Dublin lacked that a lot at the time. And so the shops open up, they prosper, businesses prosper. The rather humorously named Salon Shalom on the bottom right there is a little later in time, but it is pretty typical of the kind of ingeniousness of the first Irish Jews who were settling in Ireland. There's not a lot of kind of anti-Semitism. There was about two individuals really who kind of are known at the time to have made a public noise about the Jews who were arriving. One was a man called Arthur Griffith. The other one was a man called Gogarty. I can't remember his first name. But for the most part, they're kind of just told by their respective newspapers and by their respective political groupings to shut up. And this was, why are you attacking a tiny group of people who are, treated, as people say, treated worse than the Irish were treated, which was usually how Irish people understood these things. And as a result, there's not really a lot of outward attention or anger displayed by the newcomers. There's mayors of Belfast in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century in Dublin who were Jewish as well, and activists. So, things are going quite well for those who are arriving, certainly in a European perspective. Now, the interesting thing is they're arriving, they settle in, their kids go to school, they learn English, they have their Dublin accents. And the timing of it is very interesting because right as you're kind of having the emergence of the Zionist Congress, etc., in the 1890s, you have a similar kind of nationalist movement emerging in Ireland, led at least first by a lot of writers like William Butler Yeats and kind of activists for the Irish language. And a lot of Jewish people in Ireland, anyway, are drawn to these ideas, certainly when they're in their late teens and 20s and early 30s. And when this eventually kind of explodes into a revolution in 1916 through 1923, there are very prominent Jewish people involved. Lady de Sart, as she was known, Ellen Blumenschein, who was an activist for the Irish language and for Irish independence. Bottom left there, the rather famous Mr. Briscoe, who we're going to learn about now in a second, who was a kind of leading figure in the IRA. You have the Chief Rabbi of Ireland, who was nicknamed the IRA Rabbi, surprisingly. Rabbi Herzog, Michael Noyak, who was a lawyer to make sure many IRA guys didn't get hanged. And even in the very first day of the revolution in Dublin in 1916, there was a building occupied in the middle of Dublin. You can see the ruins of it there on the top right. And one of the first people killed on the rebel side was a Jewish man called Abraham Wicks, who joined the cause, presumably because he was a bit of a utopian, but who knows. We will briefly now watch a video. This explains kind of the context of, in particular, Robert Briscoe, his kind of involvement in the IRA, and how that his involvement in that kind of made sure that there was a Jewish seat at the table post-independence.
On Easter Monday 1916, a small group of Irish nationalists led an armed revolt against the British in what became known as the Easter Rising, and declared Ireland an independent republic. The The rebels occupied government buildings and fought the British soldiers for a week before being forced to surrender. The leaders of the rebellion were imprisoned, and many of them were executed. The executions outraged the public and sparked widespread support for the nationalist movement. Enormous crowds greeted the rebels when they were released from prison. A re-energized movement, led by Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins, waged a guerrilla war against the British. Some Irish Jews became involved in the struggle for independence. In 1917, young Robert Briscoe joined the cause and ran guns and ammunition for the Irish Republican Army.
Michael Collins was importing arms from Germany. My father had been an apprentice in Germany before the First World War, and he had fluent German. He also was quite a good businessman. So he was representing Collins in Bremen, where they were buying arms. My mother was a very beautiful young woman, very much in love with my father, and she helped my father quite a bit. And then when my eldest sister, Joan, was born, on a number of occasions when they were bringing papers from one part of the country to the other, my mother would stuff these papers down Joan's diapers, and that's how they would get them through. On occasions, they were both searched, but I don't think the British soldiers fancied putting their hands down inside a baby's diaper for obvious reasons. Interestingly enough, my grandfather on my mother's side was a unionist member of the Dublin Corporation, so he was sort of kind of horrified that his daughter was married to a rebel.
Now, interestingly, Briscoe would go on to become basically the right-hand man of kind of the... If there was a David Ben-Gurion of Ireland, it was a man called Eamon de Valera, who was actually born in New York, funnily enough, in Brooklyn. But that's a story for another day. He was the right-hand man of, with de Valera, and member of Parliament from 1927 until 1966. His son then took over after him for the same constituency until, I think, the early 2000s. So very early on, there were members of the Irish Parliament and Senate who were Jewish, and mostly because they were seen as having sided with the right side, basically those who achieved independence. Now, quite soon after this, the very first book, which kind of prominently features an Irish Jewish person, emerged, which was, of course, Ulysses by James Joyce. Leopold Bloom is the main character. He is the reborn Ulysses, or the Odyssey, if you've ever heard of that. If you've never heard of it, there's a movie coming out about it, so starring Matt Damon. I'm not even joking. That is, in fact, something that's happening. But anyway, this is a kind of reimagining of it and set in Dublin in one day in 1904, which was the day, the 16th of June, which was the day that Joyce actually met his future wife. So that date was important to him. He had been very interested in the Jewish community in Ireland. He'd been allowed to attend synagogue, not as kind of an attempt to convert, but just because he was interested in the kind of what was a fairly exotic community in Dublin at the time. He left Ireland, though, and left and became very close friends with a Jewish Italian man, Italio Svevo, you can see in the bottom left there. And he was the basis for Leopold Bloom. You see Bloom dealing with anti-Semitism in Dublin, but on a low enough level, which wouldn't have been untypical of the early 20th century, but infrequent, thankfully. There is a rather humorous scene where Bloom leaves this rather unpleasant, sweaty anti-Semite in a bar, gets on the back of a cab, like a horse and cab, and is leaving this pub and gives 3 cheers for Israel at the time as he left. And there's even references to the very first people moving to what was the Ottoman Empire at the time, what is now Israel. So because there are interesting things being discussed there at the time. Now, yes, so Ireland is independent. So how are things doing in terms of the Jewish community and anti-Semitism? Well, in general, nowhere in Europe escapes increased anti-Semitism, increased militarism between the world wars. That's obvious enough. Ireland had fought in the First World War against Germany, but now that it was independent, it mostly followed a kind of a neutral, kind of pacifist worldview. And Ireland, in fact, hasn't been involved in any wars since it became independent. Thankfully, because we're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and no one particularly wants to invade us. But for the most part, it was a relatively poor but peaceful place. Now, that said, there are some worrying signs that exist there, which will come back later on. Right after independence, the only known anti-Semitic murder in Ireland's history happened. A Jewish man called Emmanuel Khan, you can see in the bottom left there, is killed by two men who were at the time had been drafted into the Irish army. We believe, as much as from what little we know, we believe that this was kind of an unprompted, but specifically racial or anti-Semitic kind of killing. The two guys were arrested, but rather bizarrely allowed out on bail, whereupon they got a boat and got out of Ireland before they could be rearrested. Rather interestingly, the man who had arrested them, who was the chief of police, would be fired for that and many other things because he was quite a corrupt individual. And he did not take that well. And in the bottom right, you can see him in 1934 with his new group of friends, which he formed in 1933, which was a small group called the Blue Shirts, or the Comrades Association, basically Irish fascists. And they attempted rather humorously, I say humorously because there wasn't many of them, and thankfully they weren't influential, to mimic the Mussolinis of the world. Thankfully, they were very, very useless at that, and most of them were actually rounded up and arrested in 1939, so they wouldn't be a problem in World War II. Other groups of people, such as Max Levitas, a very well-known kind of tailor, he went the other path. He was kind of radicalized by what was going on in places like Russia and in Spain, and joined a column heading over to the Spanish Civil War. And you can see their group there in the middle bottom, group called the Connolly column, who went off to fight for basically for the Republicans and communists in Spain at the time. So there was interesting things going on in Ireland, but anti-Semitism exists. But I think for the most part, we kind of tend to look to Rabbi Isaac Herzog for being the figure who was able to keep the ship of state and the ship of the community, I suppose, from being too much in danger, certainly compared to what was going on in Europe. So I'm going to play a small video. It's about Herzog and how Ireland was in between the world wars.
Isaac Herzog was perhaps one of the major rabbis of the 20th century, and his talent as a builder of the Jewish community in Ireland is recognized. The opening of a school in the early 1930s, an extension on the major synagogue in Dublin at Adelaide Road. All of this is a sign of how the community is thriving under Herzog's leadership.
My father used to tell us that on many occasions, De Valera would actually go ring up the Chief Rabbi Herzog and visit him, and if he had a problem, would talk it over with them. And my father was present at many of these meetings.
He takes the Jewish community through the 1930s, a very difficult period for the Jewish community in Ireland. The emergence of the Blue Shirts, a fascist organisation in 1933, was a menacing sign to the Jewish community because of the potential and the similarity with what was happening in, say, Germany with the brown shirts, or in Italy with the black shirts. Now, Herzog and De Valera, who had come to power in 1932, were of course working closely together to try and ensure that the anti-Semitism would not take root.
In 1932, De Valera led Fianna Fáil to power, and he became Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister. He abolished the Free State Constitution and introduced a new constitution in 1937. De Valera sought Rabbi Herzog's advice on strengthening the religious clause. The constitution acknowledged a special place for the Catholic Church in Ireland, but it also recognised other religions, including the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian Church, the Quakers, and Judaism. Rabbi Herzog
And yeah, he headed off to what was the British controlled mandate at the time, and there wasn't actually going to be a chief rabbi in Ireland again until after World War II, which of course we will get to now. So it's complicated history. Obviously, you could do a whole talk about this one subject rather than the whole history of Jews in Ireland. Broad strokes, I'll have to keep it to. So Ireland is an ex-colony. Britain becomes independent, strengthens its independence, I suppose, in the 1930s, and wants nothing to do with Britain. As a result, when the war began in 1939, much like the United States, we stay neutral. This remains the case, even with a lot of pressure being exerted by people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt after 1941, 42, and when after Pearl Harbor, basically. And Churchill offers Northern Ireland, which had remained part of the United Kingdom after our independence. He says, you can have it if you join the war, and De Valera and most Irish people say, no, we don't want to be involved. This is our little corner of the world, leave us alone. People like Robert Briscoe, kind of on both sides of the fence on that issue. They both saw the merit of it and also the lack of merit to it. But most in the community would say, do you know what, that was Irish people's decision to make, and that's not really the issue. The real issue, I think most in the community had, and certainly historians and most people now would have, is that it wasn't just independent, neutrality. It was a kind of a lack of acceptance of refugees, and really that's the kind of the key issue, which is the shame part of that headline. Ireland shame is the lack of empathy towards refugees, which sadly was shared by a lot of places, including the United States, towards Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. What I would like to do is show a wee video. This is kind of several Irish Jewish people's impression, including a historian, of what was going on at the time, and kind of the shameful lack of support for refugees. If there's any consolation in it, Ireland has actually been thankfully relatively good with Ukrainian refugees since the war began there in 2022. Yeah.
The record of the Irish government in relation to refugees is very poor indeed. According to the Jewish community in Dublin and according to oral sources, the estimate is that between 65 and 100 Jews were admitted to Ireland between 1939 and 1945. That was a very small number indeed, and a number of which most Irish people then and now would feel thoroughly ashamed. Ireland was neutral during the Second World War because De Valera determined that it was in their self-interest not to become embroiled in this international conflict. The Irish army was very poorly equipped and the country was vulnerable. Ireland was not an armed neutral. Ireland was defenceless at the outbreak of the Second World War, and at the same time worked very closely with the Allies undercover, sharing intelligence, returning sort of various personnel who had been either picked up at sea or who had crash landed in Ireland. So there was great cooperation, clandestine cooperation, but De Valera maintained the trappings of Irish neutrality.
The Irish outlook was this was a British problem, mainly because we were a partitioned, divided country and owed absolutely nothing to Britain. This was difficult for my father, and it was difficult for me personally now afterwards, saying about that. But as an Irishman, Ireland had that right to be neutral. I don't think if Ireland had gone in with the Allied effort, it would have made any difference to our decimated co-religionists in Europe.
Now, in particular, the focus around kind of what happened with the Holocaust, at least Ireland's involvement in it, tends to focus in particular on one woman, Etty Steinberg. She's the most well-known of 6 victims who were Irish citizens of the Holocaust. Most died in Auschwitz. 3 others, I think, in Maidana. I can't remember the exact names of the camps now. But most had ended up there in rather tragic circumstances. Much like Etty, she was married in Dublin, but she was married to a Belgian man. I think Voxtek was his name, or Gluck anyway, it was his surname. And they moved to Antwerp in 1937. Not obviously realizing what was about to happen. They then moved to Paris in 1939. Well timed, but unfortunately thought that Paris would not fall, as it had not in the previous World War. And they ended up being amongst a very large group of people fleeing south once the Nazi tanks were on their way to Paris, amongst whom was actually the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. He was also on the run at the same time. They ended up in Toulouse in south of France, where they hid for 2 years and actually got their paperwork to make their way to Ireland, because her husband was not Irish and they'd had a son, Leon. In the meantime, they got the paperwork for their citizenship and passage to Ireland had been sent to them. Tragically, they seem to have been ratted out by somebody, and their hiding place was discovered, and the tragic results followed. The information about this was not relayed to their families by a impartial third source. That was actually rather tragic, even more tragic, if that's possible. It's believed that Etty wrote a kind of a postcard, really, or a message on a piece of cardboard, and threw it out of the train that they were transporting them to in. And it's believed that some French person, whoever they were, found it and posted it to Ireland. It had the address and a little Hebrew script saying basically goodbye, all hope is lost, etc. And that's how their family learned. Rather tragically, it came through the post box. These days, there are several memorials to her. They tend to be mostly focused on her, but more recent research, Yad Vashem, etc., has found three other figures other than the family, the Gluck family, and 3 other individuals were killed. It should be said that Ireland didn't pay very much attention to this at the time. There was a shocking lack of attention towards it. I think the easiest way of explaining that would be that for Ireland was very obsessed with Britain, as often you are with, I suppose, with people who do you wrong. And I think that kind of, how would you best, tunnel vision precluded many people for many years, really, to seeing other tragedies and other things. But we'll get to that as we go along. Now, so Ireland has, it's post-war now. The community is at its peak in terms of size, nearly 6,000. What begins to happen? Well, even before the war, you'd had Zionist movement in Ireland. There were kind of women's groups like the Dublin Daughters of Zion, Beni Akiva, kind of all sorts of groups existed. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it, really, existed. And post-war, certainly after 1947, 48, you start having people going to the new state of Israel. It helped, of course, that the chief rabbi, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel at the time, was the former chief rabbi of Ireland, Isaac Herzog. That helped a huge amount. And ultimately, it's believed about 500 Irish Jews make the crossing between the 40s and 50s over and settle mostly in Tel Aviv, if I'm been correctly informed about that. It's interesting, the state, even, there'd been a kind of rough relationship with De Valera, who was the Irish Prime Minister, in particular because he had been seen as not being sufficiently pro-ally. That's up for debate, certainly. It is interesting, though, that when Herzog dies, he's actually invited to the funeral by Herzog's son, who we will talk about now, Chaim, who went on to be the president, in the 1980s. And he comes to Israel in the 50s and is there for the funeral. And they actually dedicate a forest to him. So if you get Google Maps and you go to Israel and you type in De Valera, a little forest pops up, which is bizarre, but it's true. So again, history can be odd, but in any case, 500 leave, but they're not the only who do. Ireland's economy post-war is very bad, very, very bad. Kind of a perpetual depression lingers in Ireland into the 1960s. And so people do begin moving to places like Manchester, New York, London for work, who are, regardless of what their religion are, and amongst them, of course, are Irish Jews who are seeking more economic opportunities. So the community begins to shrink. Others begin to move out into the suburbs of Dublin, places like Terenure, where the current Orthodox synagogue is, Rathgar, where the current Reform synagogue is. Others who had, of course, moved to Israel have very significant political careers. Chaim Herzog being the most famous Irish Jewish person, and certainly in terms of his achievements. He is a member of the IDF. He'd obviously fought in World War II as well. He was the ambassador to the UN in the 1970s, governor of the West Bank in the 70s, I think, as well, late 60s, and ultimately became president of Israel in 1983. And at that time, in that year, in fact, he's interviewed by a Jewish journalist from Belfast who asks him about similarities, dissimilarities, relationship between Israel and Ireland at the time. And I'm going to show you this interview now, because it is pretty rare. There's not really any other ones, any other video footage of him talking about this.
Northern Ireland's problems are not the only ones which appear at times to be insoluble. In Jerusalem, we went to see a man with more than a passing interest in Ireland. Chaim Herzog is the president of Israel. He fought in the British Army in the Second World War and grew up in Dublin. He was born in Belfast.
I was born in a place called, this is according to my birth certificate, called Two Norman Villas, Cliftonville Road, off the Antrim Road.
Quite posh.
I don't know what it is now, I don't know what it was then, but I did go to look for it when I was stationed in the British Army in Northern Ireland in the World War. And very naturally I followed the events in Ireland today with a very considerable amount of anguish. For Israeli radio, in which I compared the history of the Jewish people and the history of the Irish people, because there are a tremendous number of similarities between us. First of all, this very vivid sense of humor, which emerges from a long period of oppression, that you'll find both with the Irish and with the Jews. An ability to laugh at yourself, which is also very healthy, and that also exists.
Let me ask you this. You were the governor of the West Bank, and you had a marvelous record there. And also, you were brought up on the borders of the Civil War in the south of Ireland. And what I wanted to ask you was, did that experience, the Irish experience, the conflict in Ireland, did that help you at all in your dealings with the Arab-Israeli problem?
I would say yes. My parents always said that they came here at the time of the British Mandate and went through all the problems that we had with the British colonial authorities at the time and the struggle here. And then we had even struggles within our own community, all of which was evoked memories of what went on in Ireland. I certainly would say that we learned a lot, and we learned also what not to do, I would say, because we learned the very great importance of sticking together within the community, although at times it wasn't so. And also, it became quite clear to us that somewhere or other we must reach a compromise with the Arabs. And in fact, the strength of Israel's case all along has been the fact that we were always in favor of compromise, right through, and they were never in favor of compromise. They always wanted 100%. And the net result was that we who favored compromise invariably succeeded, as opposed to them who did not favor compromise.
Herzog is a former Labour politician. And you sense that his plea in favor of compromise is directed as much at the Jews as at the Arabs. But if the Arabs did agree to talk, would a Jewish compromise ever include the handing back of the occupied West Bank? In the meantime, the situation continues. And for these young Jews celebrating their bar mitzvahs by the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the only certainty when they leave school is direct entry into the Israeli army. Latvia and Lithuania, Limerick, Belfast, Jerusalem. Coming to Israel, whether to live or merely to visit, in a way completes the long journey begun over a century ago by those early waves of Jewish refugees. The situations in Israel and Ireland are complex, difficult, and different. But it's hard not to feel that that urgent need for compromise applies to both. Perhaps this is a better place than most to pray for it.
Now, I think I have just about enough time to briefly kind of finish up. So we're going to be talking a lot about, I'm sure this is going to come up during the question time thing. So I just briefly will say that in terms of what is happening at the moment, the kind of growth of kind of anti-Zionist movement is something that goes probably back to a mixture of things. Some of it is to do with the Irish Army being part of UN peacekeeping missions in Lebanon since about 1976. Other parts of it is to do with Ireland's perceptions of its own history, that Ireland was a colony of Britain and often will support the underdog in various kind of causes. Other things, there of course there's anti-Semitism is part of it as well. But in my experience anyway, and I can only really talk from my experience on these things, before I left Ireland for economic reasons, I didn't face any anti-Semitism myself. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because it exists everywhere. But in terms of how, having lived there for most of my life, how I kind of parcel it out in my head is that for most Irish people, you know, there's not a lot of Jewish people in Ireland, so there's, you know, there are certainly people who go on the radio from our community and we'll talk about it, whatever. But for the most part, their point of view is, you know, it's you know, the kind of Palestinian cause is the underdog cause, and Irish people support that, broadly speaking. That's kind of how I've been able to understand it. Now, I haven't been in Ireland since October of 2023. Yes, 2023. My time span, my calendar in my head's terrible now. But broadly, so I can't really talk about what things are like since October 7th. I don't know. I haven't been back since. I can't imagine it's been good because I've been watching things through the newspapers at the time. But certainly, it peaked a month or so ago when the Israeli ambassador was pulled from Dublin, and so the current situation is about as bad as it's been. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat things by pretending that it's not bad. It is bad. The community in Ireland tend to be more of a house in the middle, if you can imagine that. A community that, because we've been in Ireland for so long, we are Irish. That's not something we contend. But for obvious reasons, have connections through heritage to Israel, and so there's kind of a very much a fence kind of balancing act that goes on in these situations. I can only tell you what my father still lives, my parents still live in Ireland. I don't. My sister lives in London. They haven't felt any less Irish, thankfully, I suppose. So if it is at all possible to kind of try and kind of understand that. I know it can be very difficult, and most times, you know, when people talk about anti-Zionism, they're actually talking about anti-Semitism. My experience is that it is quite different in that regard. Whatever else is going on in most Irish people's heads, it tends to be mostly a kind of, as we all are, kind of narcissistic about our own history, tends to be more coming from that perspective. Now, obviously, you'll have questions about that afterwards, and I'd rather finish on a positive note rather than a negative one. I want to finish with this. This is a very short piece. It's only like 30 seconds. It's an interview with two members of the community within the last 5 to 10 years. And it talks about their own experiences about being Irish, feeling themselves to be Irish rather than feeling themselves to be Jewish and having no connection to Ireland.
Most Jews in Ireland have been here for several generations and see themselves as much Irish as they are Jewish.
I didn't feel any different from anyone else. I was Irish by nationality and I was Jewish by religion. Obviously, other people regard me not quite being fully Irish there was almost an implication in it that you weren't Irish unless you were a Catholic. And of course, this is ridiculous because some of the greatest Irish patriots were of different faiths. The Protestant religion, Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, all these great heroes of Irish history. Our love for this country is certainly as great as it is for our religion.
I never thought of myself as other or different. I'm an Irish person and my religion is the Jewish faith. I've lived here all my life. I love it. I really have found that over the years I've made a bond with the landscape. So I've had a very rich existence in Ireland.
Yeah, so we'll leave it at that because I know I've gone over already. So we'll stop there, and if we have any questions, we can take them.
Thank you. One, I just wanted to share with you that there are quite a few Jews of Irish descent on our call. And so I'm attempting to give voice to them and say thank you especially. Those videos were really helpful in terms of sharing both the current landscape, but also where things have been in the last century or so. Can you share, like, are those available for public access? How can people continue to learn?
Yeah, so I have a collection of documentaries about the community. Danny has my email. You can also email me at dublintales@gmail.com, and I can send you them all. I don't charge people for them. I just have a big pile of them. So if you want to watch hours and hours of footage from different documentaries, feel free. I'll send them on to you. I have a lot of information.
Lovely, thank you. If folks have more questions, feel free. Now is the time. So you said your parents are still in Ireland. Are they in Dublin?
My parents are divorced, like all good people of a certain age. That's where my sense of humor comes from. No, so my dad lives with his second wife in Wexford in the south of Ireland. My mother lives with my youngest sibling who has special needs in the west of Dublin.
Great. Thank you. I know we talked a little bit about Leonard Bloom. Oh, excuse me.
That's okay.
Thank you. Is there someone who was the core inspiration for that character? Can you, especially like the Jewish elements of it, is there?
Yeah. So Italio Svevo, who was trying to remember his first name, it was Schwartz was his surname. He was an Italian Jewish man living in Trieste in Italy just before World War I, which is where Joyce was living at the time. The actual appearance of Leopold Bloom and his mannerisms and his smells come from him. But there's several people he would have met in Little Jerusalem at the time who would have been kind of other things he would have based it on, but primarily Italio Svevo, who was a poet. If any of you were into poetry, Italio Svevo was a very great Italian poet.
Great. Are there any particular foods or like uniquely Jewish Irish fusion creations that have influenced the culture?
It's a very good question. If there is, my family were far too removed by that. By the time I was born, we were like, as I mentioned, I mentioned to you, but I lived in Canada, I lived in Ireland, I lived in the UK, I'm currently living in Spain. So my family my father and mother weren't that dissimilar. They moved around a lot. And their parents were a bit more kind of stable, but they were kind of crazy. So I don't know how much nice home cooked meals were going on for my parents when they were children. But in terms of what exists now, so there is several supermarkets that sell kosher goods. There's a kosher restaurant in a place called Rath Mines. I would have gone there when I had the chance. I didn't live near it, but I'm trying to remember what it's called now. To be honest with you, just Google kosher restaurant Dublin. It's the only one. So I mean, you're not going to have a lot of problem. There is a bakery as well. Sorry, there's also a kosher bakery called the Bretzel Bakery. So I think it's more if the community was known for anything, it's probably more baked goods. It's a lot of bakeries. and I think it's a thing called Gur cake, which is in the pretzel bakery. That tends to be their pig piece that they tend to go, look, buy it, you know. So if you like Gur, give Gur cake a chance if you to try and that'll be the Dublin Jewish experience, I suppose. But I'm not a great expert on food.
Okay, thank you. Maureen, I'll ask if you can put your question in the chat. And we can see if we can get to it. But Alexander, in America, lots of holidays of different cultures are commercialized. This week was St. Patrick's Day. So can you talk about how Jews related to like more religious holidays or national holidays in Dublin or in the wider country?
Historically or now?
Both.
Well, now very few people are that religious in Ireland. It's certainly something that has ebbed away over the last 40 years, really. There was a rather humorous TV show called Father Ted in the 1990s in Ireland, which kind of was seen as by many people as kind of, because it was ridiculing priests. And many people were like, this is a watershed moment. This is, people are now making fun of all the authorities in Ireland. And these days, there's quite a lot of anger, still anger towards Catholic Church because of child abuse scandals and all sorts of stuff. So these days, those holidays don't really have very much meaning to people on a kind of religious level. They're more secular kind of holidays now, even though they might be St. Patrick's Day. It's really we re-imported the Irish American thing of drinking to excess. So I mean, realistically, it didn't used to be that. I'm reliably informed it used to be an actual religious holiday. It's not anymore. People just drink a lot and talk about being Irish. In the past, it was interesting. There's a really short piece on YouTube, you can find it, where an Irish journalist is talking to the chief rabbi, I think in the 1960s or 50s. I think it was 50s actually, which I can't remember his name now. But anyway, he was talking to him and he was saying like Ireland is quite a good place to be if you're an Orthodox Jewish person, because it's very religious, and you know, everyone who is here takes religion very seriously, you know. But and so I think for a lot of people that there wasn't an overt problem with it. I mean, the only time that the church in particular was a danger was in the 1904. There was in Limerick, there was a priest called Father James Cray, and he was a maniac, as often people can be, and he stoked up a mob to boycott Jewish businesses, break windows, etc. No one was killed, thankfully, but it was very upsetting, obviously, and very scary. He was removed, thankfully, by the church and sent off to the South Pacific to bother people there, presumably, rather than being fired, which might have been a good idea. But broadly speaking, the church in Ireland, I think Irish people in general, historically, because the community was so small, that was an advantage, that it was so small. It was also an advantage that they were self-starters. There was none of this, they're taking our jobs. In fact, they kind of created huge amounts of jobs and helped the local economy. And so I think there were certain things that helped the community to fit in what was a very religious society. And I'm not going to pretend Ireland wasn't very Catholic at the time, it was. But I think the size of the community, the fact that it was seen as having been on the right side when Irish independence happened, the fact that there were key Jewish people who had connections to the prime minister and the cabinet, and through them to the Catholic Church, there was always a fairly ambivalent to positive relationship. But certainly the religion wasn't the big issue in Ireland that it might have been elsewhere.
Thank you. I think we are at time. I will put Alexander's email in the chat once again. We will share a recording of this session later today to everyone who has registered. Alexander, would you like to leave us with any closing thoughts?
I suppose there's a million things you could say. I would say that there is, in my experience, a lot of similarities. I don't want to just repeat what Isaac Herzog said, though I could, and that would make these, I could easily say that. There are a lot of similarities between Irish Jewish, in the Irish Jewish experience, and feelings on both sides are very high and hot. at the moment. And there's always shouting across a room at one another going on, without either side being particularly interested in listening, maybe one side more than the other. But I do think that ultimately the experience of Irish history is that people can learn, even if they hate one another, to coexist with one another, and that has to be our hope for the future, no matter where we are, that we can learn to coexist. And that's about all the hope I can provide for the moment.
That is a lovely nugget of hope that I hope everyone can take and expand. And thank you so much for being our tour guide to Jewish Ireland today. And thank you all for joining us. We had 400 folks here, so it was quite a plane ride with all of you. We hope to see you next time, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye, guys.